climate change. It's the first time we've addressed this subject, and we chose today, of course, because today was the day of the climate strike, and maybe 1 million people or more around the world went on strike today, mostly school children, to raise the alarm even higher on climate change and tell governments what they need to do. And this is what it looked like in Sydney, Australia on Friday, as it was filmed by CNN Live executive producer Kathy Vogan.
Extra, extra, read all about it. Climate change is real and there's no doubt about it.
This land is and always has been traditional Aboriginal land.
Always was, always will be traditional Aboriginal land.
The only well-paid job opportunities currently available for Aboriginal people in our communities are in the mines. We want jobs looking after our land, not destroying them.
I didn't realise how close to home this climate change thing really was for me. I didn't realise that not having a homeland and not being able to set foot on my island homes could actually become a reality. I didn't know that I could do anything about this. I have a right to set foot on my islands. My generation and the generations to come have a right to stand on the same soil that our ancestors did. We have a right to see and experience all the beauty our mother islands have to give. So today and every day after this, I'm going to protect this right. We are going to continue to stand and fight for our islands. We are not drowning, we are fighting.
We are not drowning, we are fighting. We are not drowning, we are fighting. We are not drowning, we are fighting.
Australia should be ashamed of their support for Adani. Australia should be ashamed of ignoring the Indigenous people of this land for economical gain. Australia needs to stop picking profits over people. Australia needs to stop Adani and stop any other new coal mines from opening. Australia needs to phase out of all coal and burning production. End fossil fuel subsidies and start that rapid transition to renewable sources of energy. Australia needs to join us in this fight against climate change. Be the matangi malohi that pushes us forward. We are strong winds in this movement. We are matangi malohi. I'm going to get my family up here to help me out with this one, okay? And all of you as well, if you can catch on. We are not drowning.
We are fighting.
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 As I speak, not one of our cranes is moving in our workplace. Public servants have walked up their posts. We have workers here from manufacturing sites, from building sites, from the community services, all here today. All of those companies rely on ordinary workers like me and you to run their production, to keep their conveyor belts working, to keep their trucks and trains loaded, to keep their profits flowing. We have the power to put a stop to all of that. Justice, workers' rights, one struggle, one fight. Let our collective voices be heard right across this planet. Let's make sure politicians of all ilk understand that their job security is at risk, and let's they start making change now. Continue to struggle, continue to fight, we will win!
Indigenous people need to be at the lead of the fight for climate justice. We need to force change and be part of the change to save our planet and our communities. We need for something to happen now, not later. That sort of action would include to stop coal and gas projects, to stop thieving the the only water left in the country, and to stop burning coal. As Kamilaroi people, everything we are and do relies on climate justice starting today.
Climate action is our mission. We need a just transition. Climate action is our mission. We need a just transition.
I've got a message for our Prime Minister. That's Scott Morrison. But the reality is this. He doesn't care about you and me. He doesn't care about the planet. So I want to send him a real message. Global warming is happening, Scott, and climate change is real.
We're joined by Arn Menconi. He is former, he's run for Congress. Is that right, Arn?
I've run for US Senate. I've run for Congress. I was a county commissioner. I've been arrested in Washington, New York. I ran a youth activist charity for 21 years.
And what state are you living in now?
I'm living in Colorado.
And that's where you ran for office?
Yes.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today on
Thank
CN
you.
Live. Just tell us what are your thoughts and feelings about today's strike?
It's very emotional. I was speaking today in a small town of 7,000 to almost 200 people, students. My 13-year-old son was in the audience. I watched the newsreels today. We watched 4 million kids all over the world, 163 countries pouring out. As I said in my speech, the kids started the fight, but the adults have to finish the fight. Ironically, it's 5 years ago this week, tomorrow, that was the People's Climate March, where there were a couple of million people marching all over the world. And I almost got arrested on Flood Wall Street 5 years ago when 2,000 people took over Wall Street to stop what we're trying to stop right now, which is the global warming. And the IPCC report that came out last year said we only have 12 years left. Well, in fact, Greta said to Congress yesterday, we only have 8.5 years left. And I would submit we even have less than that. So what I'm thinking about, what I'm feeling today is we've had this amazing awareness brought to the attention of the globe today and our leaders. Now we have to go to next steps, which is action and which is radical movement and getting out in the streets and pressing our politicians to create change.
You describe a number of the measures that could be taken politically and otherwise to create that kind of change. Can you, especially in your recent article that was published with Consortium News, can you run us through a few of those measures that you described there for our viewers?
Yeah. Do you mind if I back up and just frame
Sure,
this?
absolutely.
Because what I watch on Twitter so frequently is climate scientists still talking about the problem or talking about aspirations. And you could almost see this conversation evolving in the matter of a week. Every week, new information comes out. Every week, a new type of piece from scientists. So this week, scientists came out from France and said by 2100, and this is important for our listeners, is that by 2100, we're trying to keep global warming by 1.5 degrees. That means we have to cut our emissions by 80% by 2030, and then the remaining by 2050. There's a 67% chance of that happening. What the scientist from France said this week is chances are we can hit 8 to 10 degrees Celsius by 2100. Think about our own body temperature rising 1 degree, 2 degree. What this whole conversation is about, that since 1850, global temperatures because of man-made CO2 emissions has risen 1 degree. The Earth's land is already at 2 to 3 degrees. Next week, on the 25th, the ocean report comes out. Last month was the agriculture and forestation report. So we don't have to be climate scientists to understand that we're past stage 4 cancer. And we've got to stop being what I said to my daughter, who's 14, stop being dinosaurs standing in puddles of water, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So let's talk about and so what I'm trying to get to, thank you, is the solutions. Now there's 100 solutions in the drawdown, Project Drawdown, that we could go to. Many of the top 10 that are discussed is, number one, to stop the subsidization of oil and gas by our government. And another frame that people should understand is we're almost 5% of the world's population. We emit almost 15% of the world's CO2 emissions, all right? Another would be that we take whatever dollar amount you want to hear. Bernie Sanders in his Green New Deal talks about $16.3 trillion. Elizabeth Warren talks about $3 trillion. It's a number between 0 and something. I would submit it would cost in the teens of trillions of dollars so that we could get over to solar energy, hydro, clean energy, renewable energy, so that we could get off of our addiction to fossil fuels, that we would stop all types of drilling, that we would ban fossil fuel. Oddly enough, one of the number one causes of fossil fuel is air conditioning and the methane gas that comes out of air conditioning. Another that you'll hear often is that all of our buildings is one of the major producers of CO2 emissions. So we would have to take those trillions of dollars and refit all of the buildings so that they are not emitting CO2 emissions. I could continue if you want. I have a list, and I'm going to go to some of these. But I've talked about the 100% of electrical grid, clean fuel standards. That would mean going over to mainly transportation of buses. You may have heard that Amazon, oddly enough, is saying that they're going to have a goal to get over to energy efficiency buses. So we talk about transportation, we talk about building, and we talk about the type of electric that we use. And then the fourth category is that we have to look at the way we get our food systems. And that is, I'm vegan. I'm not going to get into the silly conversation about whether or not we have hamburgers or don't have hamburgers. It's the fact that our agricultural system and the stripping of the land for agriculture and the deforestation of it is causing much of the CO2 emissions. So we have, those are 4 areas that our legislators have to go after. And I would say that a solution, being a former elected official, knowing all, I knew very well Secretary of State Ken Salazar when he was Attorney General. I knew US Senator Mark Udall, and I know US Senator Michael Bennet. These people, especially Ken Salazar, is now working for Anadarko and trying to protect the fracking industry. So we have to go after the neoliberal Democrats, in my opinion, having studied this for almost 20 years, and in the last 5 years, really working as an activist to say, they're lying. They're taking money from the oil and gas industry, and we have to prove to them that they're telling us that they're working on some types of solutions, but in fact, they're not.
In fact, that's the heart of the matter, Arn, isn't it? Greed,
Yes.
American style capitalism,
Yeah.
and
And
no regard for the consequences.
I stopped because I have a whole litany, Joe, about
Go on.
this.
Go on, Arn.
Well,
Please
thank you. I would
carry
love
on.
to, because
Carry on.
I think what the climate scientists, I mean, just to get wonky for a second, whenever you're talking about this type of conversation, you have to think in terms of the different areas that we're talking about. We're talking about the type of economic system that we're in. The capitalist system, this unfettered capitalism that's in late stage capitalism, is why we're at this level right now. And anyone who is a parent or loves children has to be very emotional about what's going on right now, because the news that we got last October is there's no more time left on the clock. The other element or pillar that we have to talk about is our political system. And as everyone knows, we do not have a democracy. We have an oligarchy, or we have an inverse totalitarian state, or what I like to call, we're run by the global corporate mafia. Then we have to look at our natural systems, and then we have to look at the people and the individuals. So what I would say to people is 70% of the CO2 emissions in America is produced by 100 companies. We need to go after those 100 companies and holding them accountable. We have to go after the Democratic Party. Stop talking to the deniers, talk to the delayers, talk to the people who are giving us incrementalism. You know, I would submit that incrementalists are today's flat earthers. If you think that we're going to be able to buy some time by rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic with this word that you keep hearing about, transition over to renewable, we can't. We don't have time to do that. We need the type of thing that, I hate this example, but World War II or the Depression, the type of sacrifices that we have to make.
I like the
So
fact that you bring up the level of responsibility that so many corporations have in this, because I think a lot of people wrongly put it all on themselves as a small individual, saying, well, if I change my light bulbs, I'm doing all I can, and it's all my fault if I don't have the right car. When really it's not only the corporations you mentioned, it's also the war infrastructure, so many
yes.
other, as well as the agriculture that you mentioned. I think it's great that you did bring up the point about animal agriculture, deforestation, and all of that. But please continue. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, no, please, you have to interrupt me, because I mean, I was an anti-war activist. I went out and said, we can't go back into the Middle East. I had been to Washington some 50 times since 2000. I knew the hallways, I knew these people, and I said, we're going back in against ISIS. I don't believe it. They tried to recall me when we went into Afghanistan in 2001 as a county commissioner, because I said, no, we're being irrational here. Here we are 18 years later. So the other part I want to talk about that never gets talked about enough, or barely at all, is this is our military, industrial, congressional, security, media complex at work here. We are bombing 8 countries. We are in 8 countries with our military. I worked with Daniel Ellsberg on his latest book, Doomsday Machine, and he would say to you that it wasn't the military industrial complex. They're protecting our mercantile interests. If it's in South America, if it's in China, wherever it is, and it's going to be the Antarctic pretty soon as the ice melts there. So in most of my lifetime, it's been the Middle East for oil. And we're watching what happens with the Saudi Arabia losing 25% of their, help me out here, their oil refineries, 25%. It shows us how easy it is to lose the type of thing that we've become addicted to for our cars, etc. So what people have to understand is that $4 to $5 trillion, $6 trillion that was spent on the Middle East, the $22 trillion that weren't accounted for on the day before 9/11 that we were talked about, the fact that there's never been an audit on the military. And then we have to listen to these stupid forums, 7-hour forums where they take 22 minutes of information and squeeze it into 7 hours about what type of solutions, never talking about the military, but talking about hamburgers, talking about straws, talking about whether or not we're going to change our light bulbs. So, this is what Stephen Hawkins talks about, why we're doomed. Stephen Hawkins said in 2016, we're doomed because of our greed and our stupidity. And it's our job right now, I believe, as a parent, I don't have hope, I have kids, that we have to get this narrative straight. We have to explain the time left on the clock is next to nothing. That the solution right now is you can look at it as an international issue. That's pretty difficult. Let's make it a little less difficult. We have to go after our candidates who are running for office, who are going to spend some $200 billion in the next year running for either president, US Senate, the 33 candidates running for US Senate. And by the way, Colorado is the #1 toss-up state in the country. And then you have to go after your Congress people. Forget everything else, I would say, except I live in the state of Colorado. In the state of Colorado, we have a Democratic governor, Jared Polis, we have a Democratic Senate, and we have a Democratic House. And they're passing these stupid bills that are making us believe that they're going to curb our appetite on the industry of fracking. And I won't get into all of the details, but there's an investigative story right there. This is an oil and gas bought state. The #1 candidate running for US Senate in Colorado is John Hickenlooper. His nickname is Frackenlooper. And everybody is running behind this guy because they don't want to have Cory Gardner. I mean, this is the reality. If this is what I told the kids, your parents will come into your room and say, hey, you have to clean up this mess. It's time for you to go to your parents' consciousness and say, you made this mess. You have to clean this up. You have to speak truth to power. And that means you're going to have to make major sacrifices. Aspen Ski Company is owned by the Crown family that owns 16% in General Dynamics. Figure it out, folks. That's a military company, and everyone thinks that Aspen is the most liberal place on earth and brags about being the first town in America to go 100% renewable. Let me take a breath and toss it back to you all.
Well, that's amazing litany of facts you've given us, Arn. I mean, thank you for that. Now, the military, I don't know if you mentioned that the military itself is one of the greatest polluters. You said 100 companies, and I was going to ask you about that. I'm glad you
Right.
brought it up.
The
That it's only 100 companies, it's only a small number of people making these decisions that we're trying to pressure here. That's a crux of the problem. There are a lot of good people, adults, who want to do that, who agree with you, but they can't because the power is in too few hands. But to go back to, it is true that the Pentagon, how much are they responsible for polluting the earth?
Well, to put it in size, it's the size of Sweden. That our own defense industry produces as much CO2 emissions as the country of Sweden, which I think that ranks it as something like 50th in the world. And that's not even taking into consideration when we bomb the living heck out of a country and what happens right now when there is an oil refinery that's burning. And and then the other thing, Joe, to bring into this to make people clear, I'm just a snow farmer from Western Colorado. Okay, I raced mountain bikes for 20 years, and so I know how important it is to make sure that every second counts in a race. And I would say we have to always tell this story. 34 states are in Republican control. The federal juris bench is in corporatist control. How are we going to get legislation passed? Let's play this out, folks. I want to play out two things. One, for all those people who are passing the joint, let's think about this. We get somebody elected and president in 2 years. They have to go ahead and try to get something passed in order to make a complete overhaul change. Whatever that is, I would submit it would have to be a sort of eco-socialist type of legislation that would have to have social justice, like the $15 an hour minimum wage that's talked about, universal health care. That means that the Senate has to flip. We need 3 seats in order to flip the Senate. And the likelihood of that happening ain't so good because that means Cory Gardner's got to go and that the senator from Maine, Collins, has to go, and we have to keep Jones in Alabama, and he's not exactly the greatest liberal Democrat in the country. Then we have to get all of the agencies of government to be able to put this piece of legislation in some type of accountable regulation that could be used. And anytime there's a lawsuit against this, it's going to be taken to the federal district courts. That is not possible. That's why I say right now we have to get into the streets and we have to do the right type strategic direct actions where, like today, where we're actually, think about this, we're having this conversation. I've been honored to be on your show because teenagers sat in Nancy Pelosi's office. Teenagers sat in Nancy Pelosi's office, and that's why we have something called the Green New Deal, which I ran on 4 years ago. Now we have the new Green Deal, which doesn't have a strategic plan as to how to implement it.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about relating to this, the climate strike specifically, is to what extent do you think this effort to address the climate crisis that we're all facing is inextricably linked to our efforts to kind of, I don't want to say populism, I don't want to say overthrow, but essentially to push back against a plutocratic oligarchic system that we have? Because it seems to me that those two efforts are so intertwined that without one or the other, there will be no real change on the climate. There will be no facing this, because the plutocrats that we have running the system of power that we all live in are self-interested, and I would say as a collective psychopathic to the point that they don't see an interest in changing the status quo. And I just wanted your thoughts on that. So
I mean, you said it. I mean, we all know this. Many people are afraid to actually realize it, admit it, because they want to keep believing in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and unicorns. And that's what we're selling our children. You know, we know Princeton told us we're an oligarchy, for Christ's sake. You know, we don't have to be, you know, leftists saying this. I'm neither left nor right. I'm a radical. And when you look at follow the money, follow where all the legislation is written, it is to deregulate, it is to privatize, and it is, you know, to do those type of things. It isn't in order to help the middle class, the separation of the rich and poor for the past 40 years. I mean, we're forced into some type of indentured servitude, so we can't get out into the streets. And then in your earlier guest, and having worked with John Kiriakou and having worked with Daniel Ellsberg, you know, and I 5 years ago today, I was laying out in front of a prison for Jeffrey Sterling just so he could get help. You know, and all these whistleblowers, they come out, they start to say something. We live in a surveillance state. You know, as soon as we start to talk about this type of stuff, they know about it. Look at what happened. I was up in Standing Rock. There were FBI people who were inside working us and making sure that, so when we go out to do this, it's to protect the powers that be. And that's why I think it's important for me to understand this and say this often out loud. There was a shift somewhere after Reagan to the global corporate mafia. I think I stole that from Chris Hedges, who was talking about inverse totalitarianism and talking about corporate democracy. And what we distill that to is, who is the major corporations making the most amount of money, operating the most amount of the federal politicians? The finance industry. That's why you do sit-ins on Wall Street, because it's casino capitalism going on with the fracking industry, the military industry. We live in a sort of weapons-based economy, the oil and gas, the big ag, big pharma, and the insurance. And then we could also add in the Israeli neocons that are operating our military strategy in the Middle East. So when you talk about, when you talk about this, Elizabeth, I don't know why everyone just doesn't think this is common sense. They see this on Game of Thrones, or they see this in Stranger Things. I mean, I don't watch a lot of entertainment TV, and I don't follow sports anymore, because who would want to follow any of this other stuff when the reality is more weirder and more crazier, and the stakes are so high?
Unfortunately, I think you're right, and I think that's a really accurate yet dire, statement about the reality that we live in. And I agree that, whether it's Stranger Things or any of these other TV shows, in some ways they are much more mundane than the craziness of the world we actually live in. Joe.
Yes, I really like the line you had before, Arn, when you said that we have to go after the Democrats, who are not denialists like some Republicans, but delayers. They know better. They went to Paris. They cobbled together a deal they knew had no enforcement mechanism, that was really just window dressing, wasn't it, Arn? And they are not getting serious about that. And it's all because of what we discussed, the profit, the greed, and the capitalist system that we live under that is preventing the change. It's more than, if the Chinese saw the US, and I probably do, maybe you could talk a little bit about China. We have Assad Abu Khalil waiting for the next segment, if he doesn't mind waiting on another few more minutes. Can you tell us a little bit about the Chinese? Who is more, the Americans try to say the Chinese are more responsible than their own businessmen, and we know what the truth is, don't
Well,
we?
I don't have the figures top of mind, but there are percentages out there that China is emitting more CO2 emission and India. But again, another way of framing it is, by 2050, the world's population is supposed to be at 9 billion people. We're at about 7.3 right now. So there's going to be more use of energy. There's going to be more of this people who thinks that there's no limits to consumerism. One thing that we should think about with China, right or wrong, is they're moving very quickly on lowering the price of solar for us, because we can't do it ourselves. And the reason we have fracking right now is because it's cheaper than coal. And so if we could get to solar cheaper, but China is growing, and China has already agreed to do 300 coal plants in developing countries. We just shut down about 120 some coal plants in the last couple of years, and that's almost a third or half of our coal plants. So we have to be realistic in understanding that this is an entire world that is trying to go after something called energy in order to stay warm, in order to have their food, etc. And it's up to the fact that we all have to be leaders. And since we're kind of wrapping up, we have to look to the fact that a 16-year-old girl from Sweden who is autistic has captured the imagination of a globe. 2 years ago, she'll tell the story that she walked out of school on a Friday. She tried to talk to her politicians at the parliament. No one would listen to her. No one would listen to her. No one would listen to her. And this last week, just look at how many people are listening to her. That gives me, again, I don't necessarily have hope, but that gives me fuel in order to go out and do whatever it takes, in order to stop the insanity of our addiction to fossil fuels and the way we eat and the way we travel.
No doubt that she and all those children are extremely inspiring, but at the same time, I feel a depression when I hear them, because it sounds like desperation coming from them, and they're not being listened to. So I got to ask you for the final question, the UN summit coming up this Monday, I believe, in the UN General Assembly. Can we just expect a lot of lip service to the kids, how wonderful they are, and then all these world leaders will go back to their capitals and do nothing?
I have two answers. One is any large organization like the UN is a glacier moving slowly and destroying everything in its path. But I think that actually there is a synergy that's going on here and trying to push something forward, just like the UN tried to do something about Yemen, but there was a log jam. There is a possibility here. I thought you were going to say, what about the UN report that comes out next week on ocean? What we have to understand here is these reports that come out a lot of this information, I just met with a group of scientists in Aspen who are putting these models and reports together. And they'll tell you that this isn't going to be anything necessarily new information on the ocean report. It's just going to be how they explain it so that we understand it better and can use it better. What we have to look for is in 2100, there's something called the Assessment Report 6, AR6, that will come out. We're working off of AR5. That's where they actually do this intense modeling of what happens. And guess what, folks? There's a lot of they don't know about what they don't know elements. They are still trying to figure out the melting Arctic and what happens when the methane gas is released from the lands there. They still don't quite understand what happens when tropical forests like the Amazon or the Sahara are burning and what happens to that. But we do know this, 50% of our oxygen comes from the ocean, 93% of CO2 emission by man has been absorbed by the ocean. So it's only going to get worse. I've made that very, very clear. And I would say to people who are a little derangedly depressed, like I can be sometimes, the best way to get over it is to get outside of yourself and do something about it. I've been honored to have Joe allow me to write for Consortium News and talk about solutions. I never would have thought that was possible, but you keep working at it, you keep working at it, and you go into Washington or you go to your state senators and you go, the one thing we didn't touch on, we're not pressing the media, which is the corporately owned media, which is in bed with all of the people that we talked about. And that's why we're getting these insipid questions asked of presidential candidates. We've got to get them to ask tighter, smarter questions.
Well, Arn, we were very happy to publish your piece. It was a very good one. So the thanks is to you, and I thank you for joining us and spending some of your evening to talk about today's climate strike and the dire situation we're in. And there might be a glimmer of hope in all of this. And if there was, you helped provide it. So thank you, Arn.
Thanks, Elizabeth.